Good night, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And with me again is Dr. Philip Karber. Hi, Phil.
Hello.
Philip Karber, the president of the Potomac Foundation, and the person who has been dealing with Ukraine, training Ukraine troops, overseeing their development, and the best guy to talk to about the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine. We are recording this conversation around midnight on the 31st of March 2020, midnight time, Warsaw time. Phil is in DC. I'm in Warsaw, close to Ukraine. In the previous episode, I introduced Phil extensively and it took me like 2 hours to enumerate everything. So pardon me, guys, to my audience, I'm speaking just for, shortening a little bit, but Phil was occupying a lot of posts in the past, and today is the president of the Potomac Foundation, as I said. You can find the bio and watch again the previous recording, which is highly recommended. Phil.
Yes.
So what do you think about the? We are already 1 month into the war.
Right.
There were many surprises. So
Sure.
What surprised you the most? And because you're great at operational warfare, operational maneuvers, art of war, if you just could refer to that, in all your answers, because in Poland there is a heated debate now about the evolution of the warfare and our military, how we should reform, and probably this conversation will be very much debated.
Okay. So, by the way, thank you for keeping the introduction short. It's very embarrassing. I think obviously the biggest surprise was the very poor performance of the Russian forces. There's several reasons for that, I believe. And we kind of go into that, but I think that is by far the biggest surprise. There's a danger in that, though, and that is that we believe that we then assume that they offer no threat, because most of their mistakes can be and probably will be rectified by change in their system if they get around to it. And so we need to be cognizant of what the errors were of this particular conflict, but also be looking and monitoring their fixes on it, because those errors are not necessarily endemic or long lasting in terms of potential threats to NATO. So first big issue there, and then we can talk about Ukrainian forces, which are a surprise to most people. I think less so to me, but that in no way diminishes their outstanding success, commitment, and elan, whether successful or not. By the way, I've lost many friends in Ukraine, and I'd just like to start off by taking a brief second and recognizing their enormous valor and commitment, and frankly, an anger in me, because all these guys wanted what Maidan was about, what their own defense, commitment to their own defense was. They wanted to be part of Europe. They wanted to be part of NATO. And they wanted to be part of the West. And all we have done is shun them. I don't know what the obscene gesture is in Poland, but in America, and that's essentially what we've sent them. And I, for one, am humiliated, deeply embarrassed, even humiliated, to be an American, to have have their commitment to Europe and to the West and to be friends with us treated in the way we have. So anyway, all right. So
but Phil, if I may, sorry
Yeah.
for interrupting, and without trying to sort of touch the emotions that apparently you sort of displayed. Do you think that this was a sort of deterrence failure on the part of the United States? Because Biden was threatening Putin, but still Putin attacked. So how do you, in terms of in strategic terms?
Okay, so let's talk about this. So actually, so let's look at it bigger. I think it's and I think that's actually where we should start. So back in the Obama days, and remember that most of or very many of the Biden people are from the Obama era, including Biden, Blinken, and so forth. The comment back then was, our objective is to assure, deter, and defend. So the whole concept was they weren't taking defense seriously. They weren't even taking deterrence seriously. They were worried about assuring our allies, so that our allies would say, "Oh yeah, okay, America's behind us." Assurance. I remember a Lithuanian, a good friend of mine in one of our European American Institute meetings in Europe, Velika said, "I'm tired of being assured. And I don't believe in assurance. I want to be defended." And we, the United States, have basically taken our eye off the ball of what it was necessary to do to defend Eastern Europe, the Baltic area, and Poland, and in the southern area. If we had, we would have realized that Ukraine is essentially the center of gravity for the center and Black Sea, just as Poland is the center of gravity for the center and Baltic. It was a total lack of strategic appreciation of that. And in that absence of strategic appreciation, and then underestimation of what the Ukrainians really offered. So I think I may have mentioned this last time, it's worth repeating. The Ukrainian military had greater capacity, more men, more weapons, far more combat trained and experienced people than the last 10 members to join NATO combined. If they go down, how successful is it next set who are disturbed, who aren't in one unified military, but distributed on a 1,500 kilometer arc in piecemeal?
That's a good message, if I may, not only to the U.S. audience, but also to the Polish audience who, sometimes when I watch debates in my country, people assume that our military is better than Ukrainians for many reasons of the past. And, in line with what you have just said, it completely is not true. Yeah.
So, by the way, Poland is not in the last 10 members, but it was the 11th member, I think, of the last members to join NATO. And I personally believe that Polish defense capability is very strong, but could be stronger. But so that was the number one failure, was a failure to realize, to appreciate the importance of creating a serious defense capability based on the two centers of gravity that overlap and mutually support each other. Poland and the North and the Baltic, Ukraine and the Black Sea, in what was essentially an intermarium, to borrow an old term, an intermarium a strategic concept. So, second major failure is the construct of deterrence. We tend to think that deterrence, we tend to talk about deterrence as if it's a material thing. I can shoot you with so many missiles. I can take away so much of your money. Deterrence is only in the mind, not the mind of the sender, but the mind of the recipient. And we forget that. And their perceptions can dramatically shift what is a deterrent or an inhibited at one point may have zero influence. In fact, may actually be provocative in another. In fact, if we really take apart the construct of deterrence, it assumes that the opponent has the intent to attack. Half the time, they may not. So it's not you say, well, we have a deterrent. You don't know that you have a deterrent. Just because he hasn't attacked doesn't mean that your deterrent's working. There's a famous joke. Policeman stops a drunk driving on the highway with a yellow umbrella hanging out of his car. And the policeman comes up to him and says, "Sir, what are you doing? You're driving down the road with this yellow umbrella." He says, "Well, the yellow umbrella is here to keep the elephants from falling down on my car." The policeman says, "I don't see any elephants falling down anywhere." He says, "See, it works." That we assume that because there's no action in our our latent statements, therefore the deterrent works. No, deterrent applies to a crisis environment when the opponent has the motive and intention to attack. So one of the problems is that we've frankly, in the West, I'm speaking generally, lost our nerve. So in the Berlin crisis of 1961, Russia, the Soviet Union mobilized, NATO counter-mobilized. We brought tactical nuclear weapons into Eastern Europe and into Western Europe. Today, Russia mobilizes and attacks in Eastern Europe, and we have to be very careful. We don't want to be provocative. Back then, we put fleets opposite Russian ports. We put submarines tracking their subs. We put bombers all over the place. Today, we don't want to be provocative. So there's a softness and a weakness in Western attitudes about the role of force. There's an ideology that's grown up. I call the period between the end of the Cold War and now the interregnum. And there's an interregnum disease, which is, hard power doesn't matter. Soft power is what's important. And I'm not demeaning the role of soft power or the role of economics or any other diplomatic aspects. But in the ultimate end, Stalin once said, when somebody said, the Pope won't like what you're doing in Poland, he said, how many divisions does the Pope have? In the end, tough guys turn around and look at the calculus of forces and say, what can I get away with? Can I pull it off? So that is a fundamental problem we have. And we've had it really, to be honest with you, ever since in the United States, since Ronald Reagan. The Germans have had it since the end of the Cold War. At least some, the Brits, some in the United States are now getting it back, but it at least partially. But we really haven't gotten there yet. The next strategic problem.
So Phil, if I may, just supplement what you have just said. Again, in Poland and across the region, there is a feeling that still maybe Ukraine was attacked, but NATO properly mobilized, showed up, in Poland and elsewhere, and showed resolve, and everything is perfect. There is also a debate in Poland whether it acted poorly or brilliantly in terms of this resolve. And I assume, and I read from your words, that that NATO is underperforming in compared to the expectations that you might have. Yeah, that's do I read it properly?
My expectations, if you look at it from the eyes of a hostile power, excuse my we say excuse my French when we're actually cussing in English, but we haven't shown shit.
Yeah. Actually, I said it openly in Poland as well, but that's why I decided to ask you this question.
And why not? What? So, and that's not fair to just throw that out. So, without explaining, what haven't we done? Well, so the alliance has turned into the lowest common denominator. So the country with the least interest or concern in an issue can essentially negate or downplay and water down what needs to be done. So the three countries in the Baltics, Poland, to some extent Romania and Bulgaria, are highly concerned. And it's yawn time in Berlin. We don't want to be bothered. We don't want to offend. We got to keep our relations with Russia. We have to have our little energy thing, and on and on and on. It was popular in the Obama administration to say, we're leading from behind. Leading from behind is not leading at all. It's managing cats, okay? This administration has made some progress. They're now doing what I call group growth. We all sit around in the hot tub and figure out what the lowest common denominator is. It's not decisive. And it hasn't worked. We're lucky. We're enormously lucky. Can you imagine if the Ukrainians had not been able to do what we didn't expect them to do? And there was now a Russian tank army sitting in Lviv.
Exactly. So
Russian air reinforced.
I wanted to ask you this question.
Opposite just imagine if that had happened, because I will tell you, there's nothing we did. There is nothing we did that prevented that. What prevented that was the sheer courage and audacity of the Ukrainians. I'm happy to defend that argument. Now, if you don't mind, I know you were going to ask me something, but let me just finish the thought. Well, I'm being slightly provocative. One thing we know, sanctions don't deter. They may cause pain, but you can go through. We've sanctioned North Korea, we've sanctioned Iran, we've sanctioned Russia, we've sanctioned all kinds of people. The evidence is very, very slim that they have any significant impact. If somebody decides they want to do something militarily, imposing sanctions may hurt them, in the long run, but it doesn't stop them from doing what they decide they have to do in their national security interest. And we need to get over it. We need to realize they have a role. I'm not downplaying it at all, but let's don't kid ourselves that they are preventive. And at times they're preemptive. When we say, we're going to do something of such and such, people say, well, hey, I got a window of opportunity. For example, we said we would not initiate the sanctions and we would not start sending new weaponry to Ukraine until the attack started. Well, and I can walk through it in detail. That's too goddamn late. The stuff that we started sending after the Russians attacked are only now getting into Ukrainian hands. And I explain how problematic that is. So you can't wait. Because what you do is you give the opponent the belief that they can pull off their action as a coup de main before your stuff ever influences it. I had Russians tell me, years ago, but I think it applies now. Oh, you pull off, you throw sanctions, we'll grab what we want, and then we'll negotiate. And when we negotiate, we'll say, please drop the sanctions, get something, and watch that. I will bet if there's some kind of agreement now that's going to come up again. Oh, yeah, sure, we'll agree to some kind of ceasefire, some kind of modus vivendi, but you dropped your sanctions. So anyway, the point is that soft power, economic threats, without material backup, without hard power actions, are not sufficient against powers that have a revisionist, revanchist agenda, like Russia in Eastern Europe. I mean, Putin was very explicit. I want the clock to go back. I want to where the old Russian Empire was. That included Warsaw, didn't it? That included the Baltics. That included Finland, not to mention Ukraine and sundry other places. That's very clear about it. China says we want Taiwan, and so, you have to be able to respond to that.
So Phil, just my judgment is, in the vein of your words, is that one of the errors that the Russians made and failed in as a consequence in this quick maneuver attack on Kiev was maybe also that their dispositional forces and their planning embraced or calculated that Ukraine is only part of the plan, and that they could seize Kiev like in 3 days, like, in a quick show. But maybe it was a secondary objective, first in execution, but secondary in importance. Maybe they wanted to show of force against the Baltic states or Poland, and in this way undermine U.S. credibility and the U.S. political position in Central and Eastern Europe, to sort of support the Lavrov's demand from December that the U.S. should move over behind the Oder River. So, would you concur with that this might be the thinking or something?
So
and the Ukrainians saved Central and Eastern Europe by how they were standing up and putting up the fight.
So I can't read their minds, but I don't, as Khrushchev used to say, it's not for nothing that they brought units from the Far East into Belarus. They brought the units from the 5th Army, the 35th Army, the 36th Army, all into Belarus. It's set to drop down on Ukraine, Western Ukraine, if things had gone well in Kiev. When things didn't go well in Kiev, they had to pull some of those off. And then Lukashenko, for reasons we can go into, but got cold feet and didn't commit to do the drop down, which by the way probably wouldn't have worked if they hadn't done if they hadn't done the Kiev coup d'état. So let's pull their. So I honestly believe that what they wanted to achieve was a change in government in Ukraine, pacification of Ukraine, because they convinced themselves that they were just waiting to be back to Mother Russia. The little brothers were going to be back into the fold, and slaughter the fatted calf right out of the Bible. Right? Oh, bring the little brother back in, and he's been erring in his ways, but he's going to be okay, and he'll be all part of the Commonwealth. And we're going to have a Commonwealth security force on the Belarusian and Ukrainian frontier opposite Poland and the Baltics. And then we're going to settle the issue about access and security of Kaliningrad. That, I believe, is the most logical play out of their strategy. They prefaced it on on a couple of flaws and also a risk. So the risk they took was they thought they could, and part of this, interestingly, is talk about crazy, but so for months the U.S. was giving very accurate warning about the buildup of Russian forces, and the Ukrainians wouldn't respond. They thought, they were convinced, they just didn't believe the Russians would do, the big brother would do this kind of full attack. Down in the south, maybe it's a little bit here, a little bit there, so forth. So what was the risk? The risk was the Ukrainians, up to 48 hours prior to the attack, had not responded to the warning and mobilized. They hadn't mobilized their force, the reserves. They had not started doing putting in minefields, putting in defense preparations at the border that didn't exist. All the kinds of things you would normally do if you were expecting an imminent attack. But you can't, it's very hard to do those in 24 or 48 hours. It needs time. It needs time to call up the reserves. It needs time to distribute your ammunition. It needs time to get units to the front. So the Ukrainians only really reacted in the last 48 hours. Well, the Russian plan was predicated on the pre 48 hours, that there was a clean, straight shot into Kiev on the west side. Well, that west side, it had
west side, not eastern side of the
west side, right? The west side. Well, it was a double attack, but it was the west side. They thought they could pull it off with a coup. So there's the route through Chernobyl, which was basically unguarded because nobody, the Ukrainians said, nobody wants. It's not proper to try and even fight in the Chernobyl. And then further over the Pripyat marshes, where there was not a bridge or access. So the Russians put a bridge in about a week before the attack. And they put their special forces, they put also the Chechen guys and the special force, plus airborne. And so they drove down that area where the Ukrainians had not previously put people. They tried with a couple hundred guys. They got to the airport. They tried to reinforce the airport. They lost the number of reinforcing aircraft vehicles. They tried at a second airport, and they got lost even more people. They tried to make this assault to try to do this coup d'etat on Zelensky, and with including their Alpha group and their best guys. But the Ukrainians had 48 hours of getting ready, and they literally slaughtered them. Then along come the follow-on forces. Well, they're coming down, and again, I'm talking about the west side of Kiev. They're coming down this long, narrow route, and with the famous 40 kilometers of bumper-to-bumper traffic, which, by the way, wasn't bumper-to-bumper traffic waiting. They basically, they were carrying guys in, and they dismounted, and they were essentially like a vehicle park while the guys were trying to walk in. And the reason for that was a blown bridge at the end of that route. So it was very, very restricted terrain and very restricted egress routes. They tried then taking a number of the suburb cities on the west side, and initially successful. You would drive your armor in, you'd be in the center of the city, you'd shoot anybody, you'd create a roadblock, so on. But they didn't have sufficient infantry to support that urban fighting. So what the Ukrainians end up with is they end up with a lot of infantry, but not a lot of, but their, and we'll come back to it, a lot of their armor and infantry fighting vehicles got severely, took high casualties. But one thing they've got is a lot of infantry. They got now 400,000 guys with AKs and at least one magazine of 7.62 39 ammunition. That's a lot of guys, right? So in the street fighting, the Ukrainians were able to knock them out and push them back. And on the east side, there were two prongs that were supposed to come in. One coming down through Chernigov. Well, at Chernigov was the Ukrainian 1st Armored Brigade, which was their best armored brigade. And they also had enough extra tanks there to create a reserve tank. Now, whether they got the reservists there in time in 48 hours, I don't know. But that prong was to basically pin them down so that First Guards Tank Army could come in from the east on the
highway, yeah,
on the Kursk Kiev highway, and then the old what's called the old Kharkiv or the Moscow Kiev highway, with Sumy in the middle. So Kursk here, Sumy here, and Konotop here. Well, they come along and they get to the bridge at Konotop, which, by the way, was the scene in I think it was the 15 or 1650s, where the Ukrainians destroyed an invading Russian force. And the Ukrainians put up a good fight and blew that bridge. So then the Russians had to divert, so that slowed them down, and they're on secondary roads. They didn't have the infantry to secure those lines of communication, so they would come in, and Ukrainians could counterattack, would pick off the logistics supply and so forth. So everything starts slowing down. Again, a lack of infantry to guard and provide the safe egress. The forces from Chernigov get around the First Armored Brigade and come down, some of them. But again, they can't hold because they have primarily armor. Now, you'd say, what's wrong with Russian infantry? Well, two things. One is they didn't have enough for this operation. But secondly, and this we have to go back to 1999, when Putin was prime minister. And one of his innovations in the Chechen war was he had two. One was to buy off Kharkiv and 1/3 of the Chechens to his side, and just by pure buying them off. The second innovation was he said, don't send conscripts in. They're not well trained. To take disproportionate casualties. Their mothers complain. So let's leave conscripts in the rear area. They can drive trucks. They can do stuff. So they go, wait a minute. Well, we have about 80 some brigades. So how do we pick only but we only have 50% contractors or professionals in our force, ground forces. So how do we do this? Okay, we'll take and create one super battalion in a brigade. So you'll have infantry, you'll have tanks, you'll have several batteries of artillery, several batteries of air defense, electronic warfare. So that unit, so like a super battalion, and it's all contractors, professionals, and so they're going to be used. So they applied it in Chechnya, and it worked there. But also the other thing they did was what they've called the boilers. So a boiler is you circle a city and you pound the hell out of it with artillery until it's essentially demolished. The civilians flee, and what's left of any defenders in there either get slaughtered on their way out or picked off or surrender. So listen to that concept, because it comes back. They tried it again in Georgia, this concept of the battalion tactical groups. So in contrast to NATO, so NATO typically has brigades, and we've long had a concept of cross attachment. Oh, you have a tank battalion, I have a mech battalion. You say, Karber, I need some infantry in this attack. I say, okay, I'll trade you one of my battalions for one of yours, so forth. And we do it at the last minute. We're used to that flexibility, but admittedly, your tank guys don't know how to use my mech infantry as well as I do, and I don't know how to use your tanks as well as you do, right? Because it takes, not to mention adding extensive artillery and air defense and so forth, is essentially creating a brigade combined arms force at battalion level. So it's tough to do as a brigade commander, let alone as a battalion commander. So it requires a special commander to do this at battalion level. So it was mixed results. When they went into Donbass in the summer of 14, over the course, by the end of the year, they started by adding a couple at a time. But they had a major innovation, and that is they said, okay, we're not going to throw this unit in hodgepodge at the last minute. We're going to insist that these guys had to go out and go train together, tanks, artillery, as an integrated battalion tactical group for 2 months before we commit them. And when they committed, they did pretty well. Okay, they're professionals. They've had this training as a combined arms battalion level, and they could act. They had enough firepower, almost equivalent to a brigade, and they could maneuver. They couldn't cover a lot of territory. So what happened to them at times is they would get overextended. Like I was in Mariupol in fall of 14, or in late August of 14. We get surrounded. Well, General Zabrowski counterattacks and cuts them off because they didn't have enough rear area security and enough supply, and they'd run slow. Same problem, by the way, you see now. So they said, okay, we're gonna
so BTGs. So what it implies is that BTGs are apparently very flexible and address the scarcity of the professional soldiery in the Russian Federation Army. But at the same time, they don't have sustainability. They don't have enough depth in terms of sustained operations. And even if they can have a shock effect on kinetic exchange,
right,
they cannot maintain the momentum, and they cannot secure the line of communications because they're short on infantry. Right?
So they don't work. By the way, and the Russians would admit this. They don't work against a prepared defense. So if you have a prepared defense, and the Russians tried this in the summer of 2015, they tried to run two battalion tactical groups stacked up on top of each other, one in front, one right, against their prepared Ukrainian defense just south of Donetsk. And the Ukrainians blew them away. I mean, absolutely blew them away. So they're not designed to do the classic breakthrough, which involves brigades, divisions, massive firepower, echelon forces, and so forth. But for penetrating on a dispersed battlefield, they're excellent for doing that initial penetration, but you have to follow them up, right? What happened in Ukraine, and part of this, I think, is also general weather. Putin made a deal with Xi. So the Chinese are not neutral in this thing, and we need to have no illusions that they're neutral. They knew about this deal from the get-go. They approved it. They agreed to support it. But Xi asked one thing: don't start it until the Olympics are over. Well, this year was a very kind of weird weather, so it was a very late freeze on the ground. So and when it did occur, it was very short. So Putin was running a risk, and he ended up being on the wrong side of this risk, where the ground got very muddy by the date of the invasion, because the date of the invasion should have been 3 or 4 weeks earlier in terms of the weather. So their units are stuck to a certain extent on roads and a kind of a linear array, as opposed to being out like this and then supported by whole units behind them. That's one issue. So, and here's where I think Shoigu, Minister of Defense of Russia, I think he did pulled the wool over Putin's eyes a little bit. In 2016-17, they said, okay, this we have 80 some brigades, so we can have one tactical group. Oh, this is great, and we got them. They're working now. We got and we're going to extend the time that they work together for 5 months, not 2. So, boy, this is really good, and it was good. Oh, so good. He says we're going to double the number of battalion tactical groups. They didn't double the number of brigades, and they didn't double the number of contractors. So, wait a minute. So how do I do this? Well, I think this is my hypothesis, but I believe this to be true. What they did is they took young kids who were conscripts. You go, Ivan, you're a good boy. You did well. We make you a corporal. You sign this paper for 3 years, and you're going to become a professional, and you're going to make good money and good boy. And for some of the kids, they took it. That's not the same as a lifetime professional killer experience, but they act as if they were. So,
and at the same time, if I may, Doug, at the same time, they destroyed the 140 years long or even 300 years long mass mobilization system of Russia, which means that they, in their strategic culture, they always feel that they have numeric superiority, and they organize troops in terms of logistics as if they were having a lot of infantry and stuff. And in this war, when opposed, these BTGs seem to be too thin, simply, you know, I mean.
Well, so half of the BTGs are essentially really conscripts.
Yeah.
Some actually are conscripts, and some ought to be viewed as essentially, you know, a 2-year, 3-year kid. They're not long termers, and they don't think of themselves long termers. To compound it, somewhere around 2016 or so, Putin pulls out 100,000 troops out of the ground forces and moves them over to the internal security forces. So there's even fewer troops in the ground forces than there were before. But Shoigu says, okay, we have doubled the number of battalion tactical groups. Well, you can't double it and not double the other stuff and have the same performance. Okay. And I think that's why, and that's why it was interesting. I don't know, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, Putin went ballistic and goes, "How dare we have conscripts? There's conscripts in this conflict." And Shoigu says, "Oh yeah, mistake. We'll pull them out." Well, by the way, the conscripts who actually are in this conflict, their enlistment, their period of service expires in 3 days on the 1st of April. So some of these guys got to go home. But Putin did this thing where he said, he gave this long thing, and he had every serviceman understand, supposedly get briefed on the danger, the horrors of the Ukrainian Nazis and da 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 da. But there's clear evidence that a lot of these kids were sent in, despite what Putin thought he had done the proper, amount of psychological preparation. They thought they were going on an exercise. They didn't even know they were going into war. And they were sure as hell surprised at the reception they received. Even their commanders were. So you have this sort of meltdown of so they're going in with too little infantry, and they are too incompetent or incapable of doing what they're assigned to do. So that's the Russian side. On the other hand, I used to say, being in Ukraine, you meet two Ukrainians and you get three opinions. I mean, the Ukrainians love to argue with each other. I've never seen a society with so many divisions and so many personalities. I'll tell you, this war it was like the super glue of Ukraine. Yeah. I don't care whether they had Russian backgrounds. I don't care how they spoke Russian. They spoke Ukrainian, they spoke Swahili. What their political attitudes were, all of a sudden, there was no excuse. This was national. So they saw it, and I think rightly, as an essentially attempt to do national extermination. And all of a sudden, all those petty, minor little disputes and political deals that divide every country in peacetime, all of a sudden, all that went away. And it was like, Where do I go? Get the family to the west, give me a rifle, give me a helmet, and off I go. It's absolutely, it's that, I contrast it maybe to the Warsaw uprising, because it is seldom do you have such a national intensity and unity, irrespective of the odds, but not taking into calculation, am I going to win? What do I do? What do I get out of it? Just a national survival mission. It is truly impressive. So I think that then now the Ukrainians, unfortunately, have lot. One thing they have, by the way, they have excellent OPSEC, operational security. So we see lots of pictures and and tweets and so forth of Russian tanks, Russian dead and so forth. It's hard to even get an accurate perception unclassified of Ukrainian order of battle or which units are where, let alone what losses they've had. But it's my belief, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, that they have taken very heavy losses of their equipment. So what they didn't have in prepared defense, they made up for in very tough mobile battle on the frontier and in the first 30, 50 kilometers along, all the way from Chernigov all the way around, all the way down to Mariupol. And they had prepared defenses on the Seversky River and the Donbass, but from Chernigov all the way down to the Donbass. So they've taken very, very strong losses of equipment, and they desperately need it replaced. They're not asking for it, but you have this sort of weird phenomenon where you go, well, wait a minute, we thought they're winning. The Russians are running away. Why do they now suddenly need stuff? They're just being frivolous and asking for it. No, they're not. And we can walk through what they need, but kind of finish the walk around. So the Russians had real problems when they tried to secure their lines of communication and the highways running through even adjacent, like the highway running adjacent to Sumy. They still haven't taken Sumy. And the forces in Sumy continue to harass and shoot up their logistics trucks driving down.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you this question. So, apparently the Ukrainians decided to defend the cities and fortify the cities and treat them as a sort of the fortress from which they counterattack against the logistical train, or to undermine some sort of so take them off the Russians of the momentum. Yeah, so they use the cities as a fortified locations where it's difficult to locate their own armed force or some sort of forces on their own, and out of it they act on the short lines of communication. So would you concur with this sort of observation?
Yes, but that's not a decision by preference.
Mm-hmm.
You do that when you don't have enough heavy mechanized force to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I wouldn't call it a desperation measure, but urban areas are manpower sinks. I mean, they just suck in manpower. And in Ukraine right now, they had a surplus of manpower, but when the mechanized forces are depleted around them, you end up getting them partially or completely encircled. And remember, I want to come back to a concept that was worked in Putin's other concept from the 1999 war in Chechnya, which he really didn't use in Georgia, but they did use in the Donbass in 2014 and 15, and now you're seeing it, and it's called the boiler. So you encircle a city, and you don't put your infantry in it. and you just take and pound the crap out of it with your artillery, and particularly if you have air, you just blow the city into smithereens like Grozny. Okay. And then you turn around and do it. And so what happened? And then you basically deal with remnants. So the first time they did it in Europe or against Ukraine was at Ilyevsk in summer of 14, when they surrounded Ukrainian forces, mostly volunteers, by the way, and surrounded them and pounded them and pounded them and pounded them and pounded them. Finally, they offered them a secure exit route. And while they were on that exit route, which was 30 kilometers long, the Russians walked that they stopped. They had tanks at this end of the column, stopped it, and they walked that column with artillery and fire weapons and MRS until it was just completely on fire. They took about 60 of the volunteers and took them to a hospital in Donetsk and castrated them, and then sent them home. In that period, they would also take, and they later cut this out. I haven't seen this time, but they would take the head of a soldier and put his, and send, if he had the information, and they would put it in a box and send it to his parents or his wife. It was brutal, absolutely brutal. They did the same thing at Debaltseve in the winter offensive of 15. They brag about it. They talk about it. It's called the boiler. Well, about 10 days ago, one of the main guys of the DNR sent a message out, which we have a copy of, to his forces in the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. And they said, okay, the attempt to do the quick change of government and fast thing in Kiev didn't work. So Russia is switching to a new strategy. It's called the boiler strategy. And we're going to encircle city after city after city in the east. And we will do and they literally use this, we will do the boiler treatment until and we'll do that over and over until they either call it quits or we take this area. Two exceptions, they said in that report. They said, except for Kiev and for Dnipro, and maybe Odessa. So clearly those three cities were on their kind of strategic list, and they weren't part of the boiler strategy. But as far as they were concerned, everything else was east, at least east of the Dnipro. And everything in that document has since, well, the last 10 days has since played out very accurately. So I personally give a lot of credence to it. The Russian military today, just this morning announced that they were doing a strategic assessment, a realignment, and they were pulling it back from Kiev, but they're still attacking Kiev. But it was interesting, they didn't really hit the center of Kiev. They hit mostly the suburbs in all the fighting. And minimized, other than attacking the Holocaust monument and the Holocaust memorial twice, but other than that, generally left the center of Kiev alone. And they're pulling back from the north. Now, whether they're going to come back or not, they're bringing additional reinforcements into Belarus. Whether they decide to rerun that one or not, I don't know. I think. So they say now they're going to focus on the Donbass, and they've already pushed the Ukrainians back off the Seversky River. So they're close to taking probably 70% of the old Luhansk oblast, and they blew the hell out of Volnovakha, which is between Donetsk and Mariupol. And they say when Mariupol falls, then they're going to take those two pincers and envelop the Ukrainian forces dug in and holding the Donbass line, which are then going to face a very challenging issue because they have the equivalent of probably 3 or 4 brigades worth there. Do they turn and make a run for the Dnieper, save the forces, but they're leaving behind a lot of the heavy equipment, a lot of artillery supplies, you can't take 8 years of stockage and support and medical stuff and so forth and move it overnight in a fast retreat or retrograde. And then the Russians are free to move right up both sides, the roll up the Donbass or roll up the east all the way to the suburbs of Kiev. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, one last thing to kind of comment on is the South. So by the Ukrainians not reacting to the warning time they had, I had said in public a couple of weeks before the war that those two causeways coming in from Crimea could be held, and you could stack I use the word, you could stack Russians like cordwood because you could hold them. They weren't really defended by anything significant. So the Russians blew through there and immediately were at the doorstep of Kherson. The bridge over the Dnieper, that huge bridge at Kherson, didn't get blown. If it had, the Russians never would have made it across the other side. As a result, they got into Kherson, and then they were driving them. So there's a deep gully on the Bug River, just to the left of Kherson. So there's a river, but the important obstacle part is very steep banks. So you can't drive an AP, even a track BMP down one side and up the other. So there's deep gorge. So you have to go by bridge. Well, the Ukrainians blew the bridge at Mykolaiv, and then further up, the Russians were driving, and the Ukrainians put in one hell of a fight and destroyed the battalion tactical group and pushed them back 75 kilometers. Now the Russians were splitting their force and going up to Kryvyi Rih and the backside of Zaporozhye. There's a battle going on right now, whether they're going to make it or not. I don't think the Russians have enough force, but I also don't know how strong the Ukrainians are to withstand it, because they've taken a lot of heavy losses in the south.
And how would you describe the fight? What does it look like? Is it like, what is the evolution of the battlefield? What does this war tell us about?
So it depends. But in the open area, it's essentially a road march. You run down the road. You have an advanced guard or advanced detachment, actually, and then you're following up. And in the south, the mud is not a significant issue. So as you run into opposition, you spread out, you try to outflank them. If you can't do that, you wait till you bring up your artillery and pound them, bring in your air, pound them, and then either outflank them or exploit after they've withdrawn. So it's essentially a series of, I wouldn't say meeting engagements. It's a meeting engagements if the defender has enough mobile forces, but increasingly down in the south, it is essentially some static, hasty defenses by the Ukrainians running up against this battalion tactical, running up against it. If they don't have enough guys, and he's able to end run it, and that happened on the west side of Kherson. So in Melitopol, which they never should have gotten a hold of, the major hub in the south, and then they drove straight. They again cut their forces in half. Half going up to Zaporozhye, the outskirts of Zaporozhye, the other half heading for Mariupol. So Mariupol was surrounded from both sides. I've got a very close ties to the Marines there in Mariupol, and I think they're in really deep trouble. When Mariupol falls, as I said, then that the outflanking of the Donbass, and then the drive. They don't have to take Zaporozhye; they just screen around it, drive up to Dnipro, screen around it, and then the Ukrainians have to fight their way to even try to get to the west side if they decide to try and pull out, or they create these hubs and try and create these defensive hubs, but then the Russians turn those into to boilers. So that's kind of where things sit right now. I think
Philip, I was receiving reports that both sides, but also Ukrainians are short on fuel. That's why they can't do too much to the maneuver warfare, and they are applying the dispersed tactics, infantry dispersed tactics with 4-on-4 vehicles and javelins and stuff, by very quickly moving like cavalry or something like that, and they avoid engagements with the exception of engagements when they hit and run, when they apply the hit and run tactics. So
by the way, there's also sort of, you may find it interesting. Let me talk about something else first, and then I promise I can come back to that if that's okay, because it'll put it in context. Ukraine had this very ambitious concept of having territorial defense, and I think it might be relevant to your own experience.
Yeah.
They were planning on having 28 brigades. They've been talking about it for a year and a half. Despite all the warning that the US was sending, accurate warning, and giving them actually hard intelligence, showing what was going on, they didn't even pass the law to start the brigades, the territorials, until the first of this year. They got one brigade out of 28 up and running. The head of that is an excellent guy. I mean, a fantastic warrior, a lot of experience, knows what he's doing. He's pulling his hair out. So he's supposed to have 28 brigades. He doesn't have 28 concerns. He doesn't have location to organize stuff. He said, I don't have the physical place to actually put the weapons and ammunition that I would disperse to my guys, let alone train and recruit, train them, get them organized. Don't wait. There's a lesson there. And for heaven's sake, do not wait till the war starts to get your territorials up. It is. You don't have any other choice. Yeah, but it's not the way to. It's not the effective way to make use of it. Now, there are really two roles for territorial type guys. One is defense of urban areas, because they provide the density that your regular maneuver forces don't have. So those become not. They should not become individual isolated Stalingrads. Generally, they ought to become. I used to use the phrase corset stays, and then somebody pointed out to me, "What's a corset? Nobody wears them anymore." The corset used to be a girdle the women wore, and they had whale bones in it, and so you had the elastic, and then you had these points of stiff plastic, or originally whale bone. So if the urban areas end up being these sort of fixed points, and then they give the room for your maneuver forces to maneuver around. That's an enormously powerful role then to have of your territorials, because they are helping them. I've helped several of the Baltic countries with their territorials, and I said, guys out near crossroad, every crossroad ought to be a potential roadblock, but you don't assign the guys a mission that's suicidal. So you say, guys, hold this roadblock 12 hours. After 12 hours, go home, burn your uniforms, hide your weapons, turn on your secure radios, and just report back to us what's going on, so we know, so we have intel on what's happening. But you can't ask territorials to put in a last stance. You can greatly stiffen them if you take for every one problem with local territorial guys. Let's say you have a dozen guys. Well, they're involved in local politics. Who's the most influential? Who owns the, it's just dominated by kind of personality. So the way to avoid that, and the way to greatly increase their strength, is to have one or two professionals who work with them in peacetime and say, okay, guys, here's going to be your mission. And when the balloon goes up, one of us is going to be here, and we're going to help you do this fight. When I pull out, you go home. You're not going to be left here by yourselves. When I pull out, you go home and set up for the long-term resistance. He then jumps the next line of roadblocks or resistance points and starts working on the third line. And when they're pushed, they fall back into the other. So there's some very successful ways of actually having a territory, and they don't have to be superheroes. They don't have to be, Rambos. And you're not asking them to commit suicide. You're asking them to put in a basic resistance and then fade. In the cities, that's different. There, you're actually using the large quantity to actually create an impossible place for a offensive armored force to penetrate and sustain its logistics through. Now, another role, and here it's not clear. We don't have a lot of historical examples, but new weaponry might give us an interesting opportunity, whether it's by territorials or whether it's active force, is to have a light, a high firepower light force. So imagine you have 100 Humvees, and of those 100 Humvees, 50 of them are equipped with 50 caliber machine guns, and 50 of them have dismountable javelins. And about 10 of the vehicles are equipped with Stinger. You have another, the vehicles that don't have javelin, they have in-law or a Barrett anti 50 caliber sniper anti-equipment. By the way, the Barrett rifle is very effective against even the sides of a BTR. So it's a very nice weapon to have for dismounted infantry, because it gives you that firepower that you can maneuver and use with dismounted. So imagine you have that size force. You use it in sort of 4 vehicle teams. And we've played around with that. The U.S. played around with it somewhat in Iraq, but again, we weren't really doing it against the main force. There's still, a hypothesis whether it worked. I personally think if you have audacious commanders willing to operate that force in this highly dispersed battlefield. Remember, there are not continuous front lines, so these units are widely dispersed. And they're primarily on major highways. Well, there's a lot in Europe, even in Ukraine. There are a lot of secondary, tertiary roads, and you know the terrain, you know where to go. You have friends who are telling you, "Hey, there's nobody here, there's nobody there, or watch out, don't go here." You do it at night. They can still track you with UAVs at night, and you don't do it as convoys. You do it in units of 4. And even they can be separated by hundreds of meters, even a kilometer from front to back. And behind them, you have sort of stations that where they can go rearm, drop any injured off to be retrieved, refuel, and so forth. Again, kind of these mobile stations just hidden in the woods. With Harris radios, you can do this on a distributed net, so you can actually have a high degree of command and control. So that offers the potential of producing these an offensive ambush. So you're infiltrating the area, and then you sit and wait till there's a column, a supply, and you pop them with what you've got, and then you don't stay around for a heavy fight. You don't stay around till their artillery gets your coordinates. You don't stay around until their air comes in to save the day. You disperse and head out. Go to another place. Another unit does it here. It does it there. There's great potential in that, in theory. Now, General Zabrowski, who was Ukraine's first hero of this war, 2014, did the famous raid, the largest behind-the-lines armored raid in recorded history. And he's an air assault guy, but he did it as an armored raid. And then did the counterattack to save the front when it was blown open in August of 14 after the disaster at Ilyich. He believes in it. He wants to try this concept. He just needs the assets to do it. When you talk to him, and he say, "I'd rather have a corps of 600 T-72s and 900 BMPs,
From Poland.
But if somebody will provide that, but he's willing to experiment with it. And I think we ought to. I personally, and General Breedlove, General Clark, my colleagues, we're trying to encourage people to help him do that. I would encourage.
You're meaning about rollover concept, yeah? That
on that one, just Americans give them the Bradleys and give them the Humvees and let them try. The main problem is getting them there in time now. To me, I think, and Americans cannot talk down to Poles or anybody else in Eastern Europe, given our indecisiveness. But I believe that if people honestly looked at it, it is in Poland, and I know I've talked to my friends in the various Baltic republics, even the Swedes and Finns, I think, believe this. It is in your strategic interest to not just see Ukraine not fail and have this end up into one more. It's never been a frozen conflict. It's been a bleeding conflict, but have it end up in one more bleeding conflict with some kind of semi-ceasefire and blah, 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 and go on for another 15 years in a neutralized, gelded Ukraine that the Russians are going to play everything they can to try to subvert and come at it one more time. You cannot make an agreement with the Russians because they will not abide by it. I mean, I can sit here and waste the next 10 minutes going through every goddamn treaty since the end of the Cold War that they violated, and yet we're the fault's ours. We keep making these agreements and thinking, oh, they're going to observe it. One more guarantee, one more. It doesn't work. I'm not saying you have to demonize the Russians. It just doesn't work with them. So I think it's personally, I think it's in everyone's strategic interest, ours. But given that we seem to have trouble realizing it, hopefully others will say it's in their interest to provide what they can so the Ukrainians, there's an opportunity in the next month, in this next phase, to not reach a status quo, but to destroy the Russian army on Ukrainian territory. And take that army and its master, who will be so humiliated by it, essentially out for the next decade. That is a real potential. It is in the grasp.
Yes, that's true.
What do they need? Zabrowski would say, I need tanks, IFVs, some self-propelled artillery. Everybody's scrounging around trying to get them air defense. I understand the shortage, and we just don't have enough Patriots to just hand out. Otherwise, quite frankly, I think we would do more. But and our army, we didn't face opponents in the last 30 years with sophisticated weapons, so they didn't have air forces. So other than Patriot, and we're still stuck with, it's an upgraded Stinger or a Stinger on a vehicle called Avenger. But in between, that critical area in between, in medium altitude defense for maneuver forces, we don't have any, which is indicting as hell. But and something NATO is going to have to fix for all of NATO, whether it's American equipment or not. That NATO has to fix that problem, because you cannot solve it just with Stinger at the low end and Patriot at the high end. It will not work when your opponent has substantial air superiority to the battlefield and missile strength to suppress your own airfields and air defenses. But I think getting the Ukrainians that stuff in the next couple of weeks has enormous potential. And I beg people to think about that. And I wouldn't talk about it. It's nobody's business. We don't have to brag about it. Just get it on trains and get it there. Get it there. The Russians will figure it out. Okay? We spend, and I'm speaking now of criticism of us Americans. We spend, oh yeah, we're going to say this, and our performance isn't a fraction of what our verbiage is. It was Theodore Roosevelt, great American president, actually my favorite American president, who said, who, by the way, was like me, a polo player, America's only polo playing president, who said, talk softly and carry a big stick. We need to shut up about what we're doing and actually get it done and get it there. And it will have an enormous effect. I am convinced that Putin, so I think, this is a hypothesis, I think Chogu did a Potemkin village on Putin. I think he told the boss that things were better than they were with this doubling the battalion tactical groups and this real cool. By the way, I think that attempted coup d'etat on the West Side is kind of like the effort they did in the South. The effort they did in the South worked. They broke through and basically unraveled the Ukrainian defense in the South. There, but for the grace of God, it could have worked. And if it had, we would be talking about a completely different environment.
Yeah, maybe defense of Warsaw. And in that vein, Phil, don't you think that this is not a regional war? It's a limited, separated event for world affairs. But this is basically maybe the first step of the new global war, and that in the retrospect, like in 25 years, will be perceived as an incident on the Marco Polo Bridge, or some sort of the Manchuria invasion. If you compare it to the Second World War events and prior to this, that this domino may now fall with all those sanctions, threats against Chinese, trade, threat perceptions. What I'm saying is, maybe I wonder what you think. Can Chinese leave the Russian allies behind and not, connecting them to electronic parts, to some other things that are needed for industry and stuff? And that would create the dynamics to, de-dollarize the world system. Eurasia will be united, and basically we'll face, and that will be only the first campaign, like the Winter War against Finland or something, when Russians were stumbling, but then they learned the lessons and so on. And, maybe we shouldn't be too optimistic in that vein. What do you think? It's loose thoughts.
So I gave a speech in London to the Royal Defense College and London School of Economics. They have a strategy session. I think it was in the fall of 2019. And I warned about Russia and China getting together. A lot of people at the time poo-pooed it, go, Karber has been exaggerated. And the Sino, the experts, Sino-Soviet experts, oh, well, they would never get in bed together because they have a bad history. Well, both Putin and Xi have described their relationship as a strategic alliance against the United States-led West.
Yeah.
On both fronts. The Russians want freedom of action in the old and essentially control, if not ownership, of the former Russian Empire, not Soviet Empire. Was it really interesting in Putin's speech? He goes, he distinctly says, no, Lenin got it wrong. And he's not talking about Soviet Union. He's talking about the Russian Empire, Finland, Poland, the Baltic area do not deserve to be independent states. They are part of the Russian Imperium. Xi believes the same thing with respect to not only Taiwan, but Southeast Asia, the first island chain, and parts of the Himalayas.
Yeah, and Phil, and this time around,
And by the way, when the Chinese came out with a new strategy, and they came out with 5 strategic areas: north, south, east, west, and a center strategic reserve. The northern one went up, didn't stop at the Russian border. It went up and took in account all of the territory east of Lake Baikal. Okay, so I have no doubt that 10 years, 15 years from now, the Russians are going to be the little brother of China. And right now, China's happy to bail them out financially, I believe. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Chinese. I don't think you'll see Chinese troops. By the way, they are mobilizing. The Chinese army is mobilizing as we speak. But I don't think you're going to see Chinese troops in Ukraine, but you may see a lot of weapon commonality. There's ammunitions flowing into Russia if they end up running, I'm sure, supply. So I in a comment I made in an interview I gave in Ukraine a few weeks ago, I think 200 years from now, people are going to look back at the 24th of February as the beginning of a new era. It's the end of the interregnum between the Cold War and this new period. This new period, I wouldn't call it global war. I would call it tripolar strategic competition. So there's a lot of centers of power, but there's only 3 centers of power today that can blow the hell out of each other. We and the Russians can each turn each other's back to the Stone Age, but 1,200, 1,500 nuclear strikes. The Chinese can only do about 300, but they can put the United States or Russia back to the Dark Ages, okay? Nobody else has. When we talk about existential threat, that term is used handily, but blowing the hell out of every city above 50,000 population and doing it over and over and turning your country into nothing but a smoking, radiating ruin, that is existential threat. And that existential threat is posed by those 3 members of tripolarity. Historically, tripolarity is inherently unstable because 2 line up against 1. So we have Russia and China, the 2 players of existential, and us on the other side. And us offering an extended American guarantee to Europe and also to Asia, which tends to get overly stretched. So that's the strategic long-term competition. How we handle that is going to determine what historians subsequently say we did with this age. It could be the age of the end of what some would call, what Marxists like to call the American Empire, meaning the American influence at being able to try and hold the West together, the West and East together. Or it could be the end of those 2 authoritarian powers in terms of their offensive ability to use force to change the status quo. It's not time that will tell. It's how we respond to that.
True.
That is going to determine the outcome.
True, and that might be so that the efforts of the Ukrainians in Kiev and around Kiev actually diminished this prospects, and the plan was maybe, a full-fledged war.
The first battle of a long-term strategic competition.
Exactly so. And, this time
and they won that battle. Now, can we help them win the campaign? It won't win the long-term competition. That we have to do over decades. But they're on the cusp of being able to do that, to take that winning battle and turn it into a winning campaign that is enormously helpful.
Sure.
Will we rise to the occasion or not? That's the question.
Sure. And, to observe this time around, it's more inconvenient compared to the Second World War, because Japan and Germany was a phony alliance, not cooperating actually operationally and strategically, and not, neighboring. And China and Russia are the heartland of Eurasia, and they can act from the internal line of communication along the main, continent on the planet Earth. And Poland and Ukraine are the exposed fortification fortresses.
Right out of Clausewitz, that you are the center of gravity of center, Baltic center. Together, your centers of gravity overlap, and you provide basically a strategic glacis for the security of all the rest of Europe.
Yeah,
and both flanks. The Eastern Europe is not a NATO flank.
Yeah,
it is the Central Front.
Yeah, I remember you doing
I said that
in Florence in front of Ben Hodges, I guess, right? He was at that time the commander of the U.S. Army Europe, and doing those sessions of war game. Yeah, so just we are towards the end of the conversation. It's very late. So maybe the last question. So what are so far the lessons learned in terms of the military, how military operates these days on the modern battlefield in this part of the world? So what are the lessons for the Polish military, to adopt and to transform the military,
Could I suggest, we've sort of gone on for quite a while. Could I suggest that I'd be happy to rather than do it in hasty, could we do it in another time when
Okay.
it's good for you?
Okay.
It'll give me time to both think about it a little bit more, so I'm not just pulling off. But I think it is the next important topic in terms more so, and I'll explain later. But I think it's more important than even talking about re-energizing NATO, or it is the next important topic for European security after trying to salvage the defense of Ukraine.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to talk about it. But I'd like to do it more than in a quickie.
Okay, so we will do it in a separate session.
If you don't get tired of me talking. So.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it.
Appreciate your
Actually, I love it.
And also all the comments and criticisms of people. I think this should not be a lecture down, but rather a dialogue between partners and equals.
You know what is even more important in this discussion about the Polish military, how it should adopt, is that there are increasingly voices around the government spheres, that if the Ukrainians do not lose this war and they will remain the military power, irrespective of what sort of borders they will have, not to go into details, we will have a sort of the alliance with Ukraine in terms of how we feel the force, because we will be more leaning towards cooperation with the Ukrainians, Sweden, and Romania. Especially Ukraine will be the strongest military, of course, next to the United States, but you will come from far away, from distance, and that Poland will try to modernize and make the Ukrainians modernize so that we are complementary, in a way.
And if the Ukrainians are able to defeat the Russians in a continuing campaign, watch events in Belarus. It is not for nothing that Belarus railroads suddenly had lots of problems. There are reports of Belarus troops refusing to go and fight. Lukashenko getting cold feet after he promised food. There may be a play there that would be truly strategic if the Russian forces are defeated, the Russian army is defeated catastrophically in the field.
Yeah, it is true. The fate of Poland and the Baltic states, Ukraine and Belarus, is always decided in the intermarium battlefield. It's always been like that, and it will remain so. Thank you, Phil. That was awesome. Today, my guest was Dr. Philip Karber, the president of the Potomac Foundation. Thank you again. And you stay with us for more episodes to come. And when offline, I will try to convince our guest today to show up again and talk about the reform of the Polish military. Thank you.